Welcome back to Lecture 2 on our evolution unit. This section is all about evidence of evolution. So what can we see in our environment and the things around us that point to the fact that evolution actually has happened in the past and, even currently is still happening. The first thing you look at is a fossil record. I'm not going to go into where those fossils are found or, the types, because we did that last year in environmental earth science. So if you want to, you can just go ahead and go back and look at those notes at the types of fossils that would be found. But really what we're focused on here is what are we looking at within those fossils? What particular structures are we looking at? And we start with these things called homologous structures. Homologous structures are things in different organisms that at first glance seem very dissimilar, seem very different from each other. But in reality, when you look underneath, when you actually look at the anatomy of those structures, they're very similar. So these are structures that they can have completely different functions from one organism to the next, and on the outside can look very, very different, but then when you get into the actual bone structure and the anatomy, they are very similar. So the beaks of the Galapagos finches, talked about that last lecture, how the bodies of the birds were all very similar, but the beaks were, the whole bird was essentially the same except for those beaks. Okay, now the forelimbs of a whole bunch of different kinds of vertebrates, this is the same kind of thing. So I have 4 pictures down here: is a penguin fin, an alligator leg, a bat wing, and a human arm. And each one of these structures, like I said, they're for different things. Penguin uses it to swim, alligator uses it to walk, bat uses it to fly. We use our forms to pick things up. So super different on the outside, so at first glance, and also very different functions. But when you look at the internal anatomy, they're very similar to each other. So taking a look over here, you have that there's a list of different bones. So every single one of these forearms starts with one long bone, which is green in this picture, that's called the humerus. So that's the bone that we have that goes from shoulder to the elbow. Alligators, penguins, bats, cats, they all have the same bone. One long bone going from essentially the shoulder to approximately mid structure. And then from that humerus, there are 2 bones that stem from that, the radius and the ulna. So you can see that in the bat, they're long and thin. In the penguin, they're kind of thicker and shorter. And the human, again, long and thin, not quite as thin as in the bat wing. But they are all there in these structures. Every single one of these animals has these same 2 bones. And then you have a cluster of bones called the carpals. Looks slightly different in each organism, but they're all there, those blue, the blue colored bones, the carpals. Then you have metacarpals, middle carpals. Again, looking slightly different from one organism to the next. And then you have phalanges, which are the spread out, the farthermost bones from that humerus. So what does this tell us? The fact that these bones are all in these different organisms, these different vertebrates, they all show basically the same internal structure. Well, what are the odds that these internal structures developed separately in all of these organisms? If these things developed separately, then it would be almost 0 chance. It would basically be, like, statistically, it would be a 0 chance that these structures would look so similar if these organisms did not have a common ancestor that all had this same structure. Okay, so I'm not saying that penguins became people or alligators. No, what I'm saying is that these present day organisms, if you go back hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago, they will have an ancestor that looked nothing like any of them, but had this forearm structure that eventually that ancestor split off into different branches, say, of an evolutionary tree, and that is how all of these these present day organisms ended up with the same internal structure. So like I was saying, the major idea is that it's extremely unlikely, almost impossible, that the bone arrangements could have arisen separately and independent. It's too complicated a process. There's no way, like it's just too big of a coincidence that they all have the same structures. So like I was saying, this indicates that these structures came from a common ancestor. Meaning, again, one of these things did not become another. When we're talking about evolution, I'm not talking about monkeys turning into humans or gorillas turning into humans. No, because monkeys and gorillas are modern day species. What we're talking about is that people and monkeys and gorillas and chimpanzees have a common ancestor that maybe is a little bit more recent than, let's say, a common ancestor between a human and an alligator. Okay, so the more similar two species are, the closer to the present when they diverge. So diverge means they became different species. So the closer relative we have, like with chimpanzees and monkeys, that just means that they're a more recent relative than, let's say, a penguin or a cat or an alligator or a bat. Okay, but they all do still have a common ancestor somewhere on the evolutionary tree. Do not confuse homologous structures with analogous structures. So analogous structures are those structures that have a similar function, but actually have completely different internal structures. So they did not come from a common ancestor. So analogous structures would be things like a bat wing, a butterfly wing, and a bird wing. They all have the same function. They're all for flights, but they have such different internal structure that those things do not indicate a common ancestor. What those things indicate, analogous structures, indicate a common environment. So homologous structures indicate a common ancestor. Analogous structures indicate a common environment. So again, human arm, here's a bird wing, here's an insect wing, okay? The bird wing actually is semi-similar to the human arm within its internal structure, which could indicate a homologous structure, whereas the insect wing doesn't even have bone structure. It's got nothing, okay? So bird wing and insect wing, they're designed for the same thing. They're designed for flight, but they evolved independently of each other because they don't share those common, they don't share that common internal anatomy. Vestigial structures. These indicate evolution because they are structures that are present in an organism, but they don't have a use anymore. So in humans, we have an appendix, we have wisdom teeth, we have tonsils. These are things that, particularly the appendix, these are things that have no function in humans, but yet we still have them, okay? Snakes and whales both have hip and leg bones. They have pelvic bones. Why do they have pelvic bones? Well, because that indicates that at one point they have an ancestor that was walking. Now why? So basically what this means is that there's a common ancestor somewhere in their evolutionary tree that needed those structures for a particular reason. For example, rabbits still use their appendix. It's part of their digestive system. Now, am I saying by that rabbits eventually evolved into humans? No, I'm saying that humans and rabbits have a common ancestor, whereas along the course of evolution, rabbits continued needing their appendix, whereas humans, they kind of found a way around it, so we no longer need it. There is several species of fish that live in caves underwater caves that get zero sunlight, so they're completely dark. Those fish are blind. Their eyes are vestigial structures, meaning at some point they had an ancestor that could see, but since they were living in a place that didn't require sight, eventually that evolved out of their population. Now, do those blind fish have eyes? Yes. That's why they're called vestigial structures. The structures are still there. So why do humans still have an appendix? Why do these blind fish still have eyes? Why do snakes and whales still have pelvic bones? Because the structures are not decreasing the fitness. They're not causing any harm, okay? So if they're not causing any harm, that means that there's no evolutionary advantage to not having it. So when we did the theory of evolution, the theory of natural selection, in our first unit, we talked about there being variation, and some of those variations cause an adaptive advantage. And the adaptive advantage means that those organisms are going to survive and reproduce and pass on those traits. Well, with these particular structures, there's no adaptive advantage to having them or not having them. It keeps the fitness exactly the same. So if the fitness stays exactly the same, then there's no reason to get rid of them, which is why they're still there. Embryological similarities, embryology. Well, an embryo, early development in gestation. We just talked about human gestation last unit. Early in development, when the developing fertilized egg is still an embryo, embryos look very, very similar if we're looking at the embryos of closely related animals. Okay, so here's just one picture down here of a chick and a human. Okay, they both have gill pouches. They both have a tail. Okay, they look very similar to each other in this early stage of development. They're also going to look very similar to there are certain types of fish, rabbits, cats, dogs. Like they all look so similar to each other that it's, again, just like with the homologous structures, it would be almost impossible, it would be virtually impossible for these embryos to all have these same similar structures if they didn't have a common ancestor, if they were not related at some point in the evolutionary tree. And molecular biology. So molecular biology, we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty with the looking at proteins and DNA, so the specific molecular structure of these organisms. If you're looking at specific gene sequences, two species that are very closely related are going to have specific nucleotide sequences that are very similar. So I don't know if you remember this, I hope you do, but when we talked about DNA, humans share approximately 99% identical DNA. Okay, which means that most of our genes, the majority of our genes, are exactly the same from one person to the next. So you could look at a particular sequence, identify this gene, and say, yes, that's a human gene. Well, if you take that same gene and compare it to, say, a chimpanzee, they're probably going to have the same gene in the same spot with some slight differences. Okay, you can take those differences, the number of differences, and compare that with and you basically use it in order to determine, well, here's how long ago approximately these two species diverged from a common ancestor and became different. So you guys have a worksheet posted in today's folder. This is also in your note packet, but I gave you the worksheet as a full worksheet just in case you wanted to see just in case you wanted an actual full worksheet, okay? So all we're doing here, so you have species A, species B. It doesn't matter which species is which, okay? All you have here in front of you, and the first part is already done. You look at each species letter to letter, and every time there is a difference in the sequence, you put a circle around it. Okay, now what we're doing here is we're counting how many letters in this particular sequence, so it's the exact same gene sequence in different organisms and two different species, and you're trying to figure out how many differences there are total. Okay, so notice I'm not circling species A and species B. No, I'm just circling species B because that indicates one difference. Okay, so one difference, two difference, three difference, four difference. So what you would do is go through, match it up, apples to apples, every single letter, and every single time a letter is not the same, you would circle it. Now sometimes I like to separate these out into like groups of 3, just to make it easier to count all the way through. But as you can see, the circling part is already done for you. And in this case, when you count them all up, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Number of differences is 19, okay? And you can count up all of these letters if you want to, but I made it super easy for you. all of these letters together, the number of those differences altogether, or the number of letters altogether, is 100. Okay? Super simple, because if I ask you for the percent of letters that are different, we all know by now that percent equals part over whole times 100. So you have 19 over 100 times 100. These cross out, and you just get 19%. Now, here is the part where you have to do a little bit more math, a little more thinking here. If I tell you that every 1 million years a 4% change happens, so every million years 4% change, how many millions of years ago did species A and species B diverge? So we're going to set up a proportion. It's actually quite simple. We're going to put 4 over 1, because this is 4%. And then what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for how many years as a 19% change. And then X is what we're looking for. How many years is that? So we have the percentages here and here set up in the same spot. And then we've done this before. We cross multiply. 19 equals 4X, which gives us, divide both sides by 4, and what you get is 4.75 million years ago. And that is approximately how long it has been since species A and species B diverged from each other. Do not round this number. Like, if you get this number, and make sure you have it at least to the second decimal point, the hundredths, okay? Because remember that we're talking about 4.75 million years ago, which actually is this. So if you were to just round that up to 5, well, now you're missing 250,000 years, okay? So be prepared to have a question like this on your final test of the year. Review all of your, review the rest of the evidence for evolution, and then complete the short quiz on this lecture.